Switch back and forth. We can share. So let me just start by saying thank all of you for everything you do. I know what Results does, and I know you all have other lives and other jobs. And let me just tell you that you have been incredibly effective, again and again and again for 35 years. And let me first of all just tell you a little bit about your leader. Joanne really taught me in so many ways how the world actually works. And so I came here for the first time because we met, we started talking about TB, and then she started introducing me to people, and she had this sense of what it takes to make things move. But of course, as you all know, she's got this wonderful personal touch. And so she brought me in for the first time to see Congressman Sherrod Brown and said, just explain to Sherrod about tuberculosis. And so I went on, literally, the meeting was supposed to be for like 20 minutes, and it went on for an hour and a half on tuberculosis. And, she briefed me, but I just didn't get it in my head. I didn't know what to ask for. So at the end of this hour and a half brief, Sherrod Brown said, so what can I do for you? And I panicked. I didn't know. So I said, why don't you go to Siberia with me, right? I figured, that has to appeal to everybody, right? and the great news that Sherrod happened to be a Russian major when he was at Yale, so he said yes. We spent a week together touring the Russian prison systems. We actually went to Siberia and looked at the prisons, and Sherrod got into his head in a very unique way what it means to be poor, to have just be part of a country that's gone through this transition where they went from 10% poverty to over 60% poverty, and then be accused of really a crime against property, often stealing food, and then be in a prison and be afflicted with drug-resistant tuberculosis. So Sherrod became a lifetime advocate. He's still, I think, one of our most important advocates. But more than anything else, it was that, and then innumerable experiences afterward, where I learned so much from Joanne, and continue to learn from her, and we hope to be very, very close partners for a very long time.
But just think of is this working? All right, I don't know what I'm doing with these today. I think I got it. All right. But seriously, consider the lobbyist dream of being able to bring Jim to talk face-to-face with policymakers about drug-resistant TB. And I'm going to I'm segue into a first question, which is, the lessons that you learned from the 3x5 initiative, and for people that maybe don't know about that, maybe say a word, but just, again, not just proving it's possible, but sort of setting those bold goals, and how that really fed into the work of coming to the bank and setting this goal for eradicating extreme poverty and reducing inequality for the bottom 40%.
Well, one of the most important things that we learned is that while I could come to a results meeting, and I did. Remember, Joanne, in Seattle, I came to a lot of results meetings, and I would talk about the moral imperative to deal with tuberculosis and HIV. And you guys would come through. You would make calls, write letters, talk to people, and you guys would come through based on the moral imperative. But then what was happening in the rest of the world, even in our world of global health, was that the moral imperative wasn't strong enough to overcome fear, to overcome low aspirations, to overcome some sense that the scientific data suggests that we shouldn't do this. And I kept saying, but wait a minute, 25 million people in Africa are infected with HIV. We have a treatment. And you're telling me that we should not try to treat them because of what? Well, it's too expensive. Well, but then I would come back and I would say things like, but these are just drugs and it costs pennies to actually make them. Now, the high cost is because they're trying to recover their costs of research, but there are all these solutions. No. And it's too complicated. Well, actually, we've shown that it's possible. Still, it's too complicated. So there seemed to be, among people from our tribe, people who are global health people, not just a reticence to try something bold, but an anger, literally an anger that we would suggest something as crazy as treating drug-resistant TB or treating HIV. And so the most important lesson I learned is that you have data, you have evidence, which is always partial, which is always limited by our ability to capture data, always limited by our human limitations of being able to do sophisticated enough analyses. And then you have the power of moral suasion and reasoning. Is it okay when there is treatment that exists in the world to tell 25 million Africans that they're dead? Is that okay? And so because we decided that that was not okay, we pushed and we pushed and we pushed. And it turned out that HIV treatment has had, probably it's in the top 5, most important impacts on economic growth in Africa. And we didn't know that when we started. And I spoke with Josh Bolton just the other day, and I thanked Josh, was George W. Bush's chief of staff. And I said, you know, Josh, you guys did this, PEPFAR, on the basis of a moral commitment. But did you know that in some places, every year of HIV treatment extended the life expectancy of the population by a year? Did you know that among the 2 most important things, and I, you know, nobody that I know has done the actual analysis, but I would say that the 2 of the most important impacts on growth in Africa over the last 5 years, which has been over 5%, no one expected it, has been 1, the Jubilee movement, debt relief, which I know you're also involved in, and 2, HIV treatment, both of which were discounted, you know, out of hand as illogical, as unsustainable, and as things that you just shouldn't do. Not spoken out of humility, not spoken in a way that says, well, you know, it would be great to do them, but we just can't quite do them. I remember I was there. It was anger that we would even suggest it. So the thing that I have learned is that you have to have a very what's the right word? You have to have a balance between, you know, moral reasoning and thinking about what is the right thing to do, and then pair that with a humility that you may not have all the evidence right now for why this is the right thing to do, but you know what? It's just the right thing to do. You guys have always done that, and I would just say continue to do that.
Thanks. Thanks. Maybe honing in on some specific particular opportunities, and then maybe coming back to the sort of bigger picture around how do we build the political momentum on this. But we just were talking with Raj Shah and Seth Berkley about the opportunity of actually accelerating the end of preventable childhood deaths and kind of where we are on that. And we and many of our partners have advocated for a long time for increased funding, bold targets, increased impact. But we've also had really, in some ways, limited options for mobilizing resources for funding mechanisms to drive measurable results for the poorest. You know, Gavi being an exception to that, and work we've done with UNICEF, but challenges in some ways globally. And the banks learned a lot about driving results and impact in this area from this Health Results Innovation Trust Fund for Child and Maternal Health. And we're really enthusiastic about figuring out ways to work together to build on that. So it'd be great if you could just say a little bit about, you know, what it is for people who aren't as familiar, like what you've learned, and what could be the potential for scaling that up to really drive key interventions, and especially for the poorest, and also in some ways including leveraging the bank's own IDA resources, and how might we work together?
So, you know, it's a very simple idea that you not just provide inputs, but then you pay for results. In other words, when you achieve the results, you get the payment for the next next set of activities. And so the impacts, I just wanted to read you some of the data. In Argentina, where we implemented this approach, neonatal mortality dropped by 74%. Focusing on results is really, really important, and it's part of the change that we're going through at the World Bank Group right now. Rather than focusing on getting money out the door, focus on actually having an impact on the ground, and it's not easy to do. And yet the experiments we've done have been great. In Zambia, the use of modern family planning increased by 109% through results-based financing in just 1 year, and in Zimbabwe, child immunization rates nearly doubled from 33% to 62% in a single year because we focused on results. So again and again and again, in my work in the poorest settings, is that healthcare workers, health workers in even the poorest settings love to be able to demonstrate results. And giving them an opportunity to do so is, I think, really important. And, there have been some resistance, there's been some resistance from the part of certain governments. And we need to now persuade them that even though it is a little bit risky, and riskier than the way we did it before, it's not at all risky from the perspective of the results you get. And after all, that's really what we're after.
Great. Great, thanks. And I think, again, really look forward to working, even in meetings that we're going to be having in the next couple of days, and going forward working with Tim Evans, who's leading on health, and others in your team to look at how to build this out, kind of to sort of take opportunity to the next level. So kind of building on that and kind of linked to that, on this whole issue of tracking results and tracking progress out of poverty, again, having met with a number of, seeing what you all are doing, but also having met with a number of folks on your team that are working on the poverty tracking and equity issues, it's clear there's extensive efforts on measuring poverty from the national economic data. So it's, I think, for all of us to know as well, but also looking at how to use some of these sort of poverty measurement tools, kind of scorecards, to be able to do quicker assessments and seeing how to make that work. We want to explore about how we can kind of bring attention annually to that progress out of poverty. But also in this area of kind of tracking results, I think where we see globally, I mean, with the bank, with almost really every institution and country that's working on this, where there maybe is more of a gap, is how are poverty measurement and poverty targeting tools, could they be applied systematically across a whole array of sectors to really be, whether it's health, education, agriculture, to ensure that bank-supported programs are reaching the very poor with those kind of essential services. So how do we sort of really dig into that and also measuring, just as you've been trying to do, impact for the poorest quintiles?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's the situation that I found when I got to the bank was that we announced poverty numbers every, I think, John, 3 years, was it? Or 2 years? 3 years, every 3 years. We would announce poverty numbers every 3 years, and the data was 2 years old. And when I asked why is it this way, it's because inside the World Bank Group there was just such a focus on rigor and being sure about the numbers. We were the ones who put the numbers out. And so I turned around and asked that same group, well, can you measure them every year? And I wasn't sure what response I would get, but actually the leaders of the poverty group got very excited because they're saying, we would love to try to measure this every year. And from my perspective, the key, and I've learned this from 3x5, I've learned this from all the other movements, that if you have something that you're measuring on a regular basis, and then you announce those numbers on a regular basis, and you stand up and say, here's where we're making progress and here's where we're not making progress, it actually really helps. Every movement has to have sort of pace and rhythm and a kind of clock that's getting people excited. And you also have to stand up and say, this is where we're doing well, this is where we're not doing well. 3x5, it was incredible. Every 6 months, we would announce who was making progress and who was not. And it created a very interesting dynamic, and things moved much more quickly than they would have otherwise. So that's our goal. And so we would like to get to the point where we're using all these much more sophisticated techniques to measure poverty every year, to get a really good snapshot. But as Joanne mentioned, the really important thing is we have to now do what we're looking at, geomapping, not only of our own projects, but of where the poor people are, and ask some tough questions, not only of us, but of everybody. We have to say, are you doing work where there are actually poor people? Are your clinics set up where it's convenient for you, or are your clinics set up where there really are poor people who need access to the clinics? This is going to be a tough process, but as we start looking at things and as we start trying to do the mapping, this is tough. This is going to be unhappy news for a lot of organizations, but I think we have to go through with it. Just to give you a sense of how well this is working, so even in places like Syria, we're now with new technology, we're able to pre-map where we're going to need to do our work. Where is it that hospitals have been destroyed? Where is it that schools have been destroyed? And so we're now preparing a plan for when the peace comes in Syria. When that will happen, we're not sure, not in the next year, but when it does, we have to move quickly. And there's so much more information that we can have now. There's just no excuse for not knowing where the poor live and then targeting our efforts accordingly. Yeah.
No, it's great. And I think, again, given your role, it's, I think in many ways, and some of the other folks on the team as really thought leaders on this and about this measurement, I think also looking at, in a way that could, I think, support countries and other donors to do this, which is also, like, do we know the benefits of each of these sectors are really getting down to that bottom, 2 quintiles, and how do we measure that and how do we report that? So I just feel like it's an exciting opportunity to really lead. So maybe going to just to a bigger question, too, and I think this is going to be just, frankly, an evolving conversation, but given that, in this room you've got folks from all over the United States who've been doing advocacy on this, you've got these 100 young leaders in our Real Change program who are part of a year-long fellowship, and you've got partners from 12 countries, who are meeting with members of Congress, the media, their World Bank EDs, and other decision makers. Just trying to think about how we can use that capacity to work more closely to drive these goals. So the goal of eradicating extreme poverty, but also, as you've been talking about, reducing inequity, and then specific goals around health, education, and other sort of shared priorities, financial inclusion. Like how do we work together?
Well, let me just tell you a little bit about my history with the World Bank Group, and also where we're trying to go, because I really do, if I could ask a favor, I really do need your help in communicating what the new World Bank Group is. And frankly, it's not so new. I mean, there's a lot of these pieces were all there, but kind of hidden under the veneer that people took at face value. I need your help in communicating this particular vision to members of Congress. And so, to go back to my history, in the late 1980s when we founded Partners in Health, and into the mid 1990s, what we kept finding was that no matter what we did, broader policy initiatives seemed to just throw water on or destroy some of the things we were trying to do. And what were the currents out there? Structural adjustment was the catchphrase. The Washington Consensus was in full force. And let me tell you, there are things about the Washington Consensus that were great and are important and are still valid. It's really important for countries, no matter what income level, to have fiscal discipline. In other words, they shouldn't spend, profitably on things that are not helpful. And, we have things today that people still spend on that are not helpful, like fuel subsidies. And it was important for the bank to say, have fiscal discipline. That was important. It was important for the bank to say, have independent central banks so that you don't print money whenever you think there's a crisis, because that is a dead-end road. That was important. It was really important to say, analyze your public sector expenditures to see which ones you really are committed to and which ones you're not. That was really important. But what we didn't like was the notion that economic growth would solve all problems. And what we said was, economic growth will not solve all problems, and it's really important to invest in people. But, the bank said there's no evidence for that, and those are fiscal expenditures, and you've got to keep those in check. So the notion was that you should reduce your health expenditures, and they would say, well, we never actually said reduce, but what we said was reduce your budgetary expenditures, and sometimes health and education fell in that. And so I actually was part of protests right in this city called 50 Years is Enough, and I actually protested the World Bank and argued that it should be closed. And I have to tell you, I'm glad we lost that argument. Because right then, in 1995, my good friend Jim Wolfenson became president, and he began listening far more than the previous presidents. And so what's happened in 20 years? Well, in so many ways, in the most interesting and helpful ways, the evidence has caught up with the ethics. And so now we have studies that say that from 2000 to 2011, fully 24% of the economic growth in low and middle income countries was a result of better health outcomes. 24% of growth, right? Not 24% of health, 24% of economic growth. And we also have this powerful evidence coming out of OECD, and there's a test called the Program for International Student Assessment. And it turns out that the way that countries do in terms of their 16-year-olds performing on that test is very strongly correlated with economic growth. So now, education is not just nice to invest in, it's critical if you want your economy to grow. We kind of always knew that, but now we have the evidence. And so the bank is nothing if not committed to evidence. And so now the tune has changed completely, right? But back in those days, I think we were making powerful points. Now, so how is it that we've changed? Well, first of all, this goal to end poverty, right? You know, the 188 member countries agreed that we want to end extreme poverty by 2030. That's fantastic. And the reason that's fantastic is because we have to go to 2030 and then come backwards and say, what kind of organization do we need to be to actually be able to contribute to that? But the other thing that's even more powerful is boost shared prosperity. In other words, boost the incomes and the participation of the bottom 40% in economic growth. And this was the most radical statement we could make fundamentally about inequality. We have never committed to measuring inequality before, but now we are. We're going to ask the question every year, to what extent is the income of the bottom 40% growing vis-a-vis the economy? And we're going to name this. We're going to say, the economy grew 3% and the share of the bottom 40% only grew 1%. You've got a problem, right? Now, so what does that mean? So what that means is that we have to retool our organization to try to accomplish those goals, because our governors, 188 member countries, embrace those goals. Right? And so one of the things we're doing now is to say, so what is our role? What can we really do? And I just want to take you back and say 20 years ago, to think that there would be the current conversation we're having on inequality would be unthinkable, even 10 years ago. Right? But even, in 2007, right before the financial crisis, it would have been unthinkable that we would have these kinds of conversations today about inequality. I just saw Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs say on a CBS This Morning show, hey, inequality is one of the worst problems we have. This is creating instability in our society, and we need to find those levers to pull and the buttons to push to reduce inequality and make sure that more people share in GDP. And in a totally bizarre development that I can't ever remember when this has happened before, but Thomas Piketty's 700-page nerdy volume on capital in the 21st century was the #1 selling book on Amazon for a good period of time after it was translated into English. And his book says that global capitalism is moving in a direction where return on the investment of wealth will always be greater than the growth of the economy. So the rich will continue to get richer, and the poor won't. Poor's income will not grow anywhere near the rate. So inequality will worsen. And his suggestion is that we should have a global tax on wealth. And maybe it's something that results can accomplish, but I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime in the near future. And then to have the top tax rates be at 75 or 80%. And the only country that tried that is France, the so-called Piketty tax. And that's had mixed results. So while we wait for that, the question is, what can we do today, given that global market capitalism is the de facto system that everyone has to deal with? What can we do today to move toward greater equality and greater convergence? And he has just one page. There's one page in the book that says the two things that have historically always moved us toward lesser inequality between and within nations is the diffusion of knowledge and investing in people, especially their education and skills. So we at the World Bank Group now are thinking, wow, that's what we do. So when we help people build roads, can we step back and say, is there a way to build roads that will increase equality of access to markets? Is there a way to look at energy? Is there a way to look at infrastructure? Is there a way to look at everything we do and look at it through the lens of how can we help countries both grow their economies and reduce inequality? That's actually our mission statement now. That's actually what we have to do every day. So I just want, let's get the message right. The tremendous gains that we've had in reducing the number of people living in extreme poverty. A lot of it was done in Asia, China, and India, and it happened because of economic growth that created jobs. So let's not get this wrong. We are totally for economic growth. We need economic growth. We need job creation. But isn't it amazing that we can now have this conversation that says everyone agrees, including Lloyd Blankfein, that we need to reduce inequality, so the job is to find ways of growing the economy in a way that everyone can participate. That's what we do, and I need you to give that sense to the members that you see, that we are part of not just a hard-headed, sort of unfeeling sense of growing GDP. That's not who we are. What we now have as explicitly our goal is to end poverty and make sure that everyone participates.
Your point going back around, around the challenge of financial taxes, I would just say, if there's anybody that can do it, our European partners are working hard on that financial transaction tax, and our French partners, so they are working on that piece as well. And the other thing I would say, Jim, is that you also have played a really key role, just on this quick point before moving to something else, is just, some of those issues that really have been there, even holdovers around structural adjustment, like user fees, point of service user fees. You made very strong statements about that. So sort of also looking at those pieces of kind of policy that have not worked and that have actually increased inequality. So just a acknowledgement to you for that and how important that has been. But kind of, again, going to this point about how do we create that kind of more inclusive growth, certainly one piece of it is this whole arena of financial inclusion. And so just sort of again around some of the specifics about where we're going, but also this broader movement building, we house the Microcredit Summit campaign. It is the largest umbrella for poverty-focused microfinance programs and has set its own goal of helping move 100 million families over the poverty line. And just see real opportunities to work much more closely together, and some of the very specific poverty measurement stuff, but also this broader, like how does that whole movement really, even in a more central way and in a way from the bottom up, help drive the achievement of both the poverty eradication goal, but also the goal of reducing inequality. So we'd love to just hear also some of what you're seeing internally around this issue of financial inclusion and what's happening.
Well, we set a goal, or let me put it this way. My team talked me into announcing a goal of universal access to financial services by 2020. That's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard. We really need your help on this. I think it's a great goal, and it's one of the goals that's very, very encouraging in the sense that market forces will help us. The people who want to sell goods want people to have access to financial services, and it helps people to have access to financial services, but it's going to be one of the really hard ones to achieve. And we're now, and I hope you're all part of the conversation, trying to come up with a plan for how we can actually get there. So, it is so critical. So I think it's critical, in and of itself it's critical, but I think it's really critical around issues of gender equality. Yep. Right? And this is a huge gender equality issue. Right? But, I think it's also just a matter of getting the right people around the table. So there are things that are happening in the world that are so exciting to me. The Aadhaar initiative in India, where Nandan Nilekani and his team have registered, I don't know, Bobby would know this, 600 million people by now, I think. How many? 600 million people with 10 fingerprints, 2 iris prints, and a 12-digit number. And so the way it works is that all it does is that if you put your finger in a machine that is, that people can carry around anywhere in India, and have your 12-digit number, the computer says that is the person related to that number. And so what it's allowed is that it allowed the Indian government, rather than have to send payment to part of a bureaucracy, and by the time it goes through all the bureaucracy, you lose something, right? You can have these ATM systems, literally, where it's a table in the middle of a field in Uttar Pradesh. You put your fingerprint on it, you give them the number, and you get cash directly. So, you know, it's 600 million people, and last time I saw Nandan, it was 400 million. He's going to get everybody in India registered. So this is the beginning of the possibility of having everyone having access to a bank account, for example. I look at Alibaba in China, and Alibaba has, you know, revolutionized the ability of even the poorest rural dwellers to participate in the global economy, and he's done it in a way that's just brilliant. He's also given them access to financial services. By he, I mean Jack Ma and Alibaba. So there are models out there right now that are completely turning global capitalism on its head and giving us the possibility of having everyone participate in the market. You know, Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, said to me, you know, he himself lives a very modest lifestyle. He said, my dream is that somebody can wake up in Pittsburgh, place an order for a product from Kenya, and have it delivered with Chinese couriers to their home the next day, and give the producer in Kenya a much higher profit level, because, you know, the way he's changed things is that it used to be that producers in rural villages would only get the cost of their manufacturing plus 5%. And yet, when that product reached the market, it was cost plus 3 times or 5 times the manufacturing cost, because everyone in between got a piece of it. He now gives the producer manufacturing cost plus 50%, and then he gets it directly to people at a very low cost, and everyone wins except, well, of course, these intervening players. And yet, the job creation that has happened has been so fantastic that the Chinese government has embraced this, right? So, you know, how this will work, I'm not sure. But the great news is there are these pieces that if we just get them together, we actually could get to universal access to financial services by 2020. So please, you know, get behind this movement, you know, demand that we focus on it, demand that everyone focuses on it, and find opportunities to make it happen.
It's great. It's great, and I think, again, you know, this is a great follow-up, because I think there's many of these big and small institutions that we're working with and supporting that really want to both, you know, drive broad reach, but also that down reach, and I think can really want to be part of that, achieving that goal as well as the broader one. In a couple other really key areas, and you touched on this earlier, I mean, education obviously is a critical driver for all of it, the poverty goal, but everything we're trying to achieve, and the bank is a central player in investing in education. So question of how can the bank and results work together, both to accelerate progress, but also to reverse. We know most of this money is going to come from countries themselves, but how do we reverse the decline in donor aid to basic education at a point where, you know, we got to get to those last mile kids, and also to really universal secondary education. So how can we work together to both drive success but also reverse the decline in donor funding?
Well, I think, again, I think it's part of retooling our message around education. So if education is simply thought of as, you know, getting kids, you know, into schools, getting kids into seats, it sounds like sort of a mission that is really about charity. But I think every piece of evidence suggests to us that, you know, if you want to improve stability, which improves the prospects for peace, if you want to improve the economic growth, really investments in education are a key part of it. And I don't think people still understand the relationship between the creation of future markets for their goods and investments in education. And so I think we have to work out those details on a much more fine-grained level, meaning that are we doing everything we can to ensure that the quality of education is better and that learning actually happens. And again, I think we have to step back and say, are there fantastic new innovations in education that can help countries leapfrog generations of bad practice and get to where they're providing state-of-the-art education in a very short period of time? And you know, usually it's like, well, you know, you have to have better teachers. Yeah, but what about Khan Academy. Saul Khan is one of the great teachers of all time, and what Saul is trying to do is to get his materials reproduced in hundreds of different languages. And this is not about technology. The Khan Academy, the great thing about the Khan Academy is only slightly in kind of in a non-direct way related to technology. It's about great teaching. And that's one thing that we know, that great teaching is the key. And so, Saul once told me that there are going to probably be, at the end of the day, 2 people in the world who teach everyone else calculus. Because there is such a thing as people who can really, really teach well. And so the thing to do might be to not use technology to have whiteboards and distract people with internet searches, but to actually use technology to get the best teachers in front of kids in the Central African Republic today, and see if that helps us leapfrog generations of bad practice. Now, this is all possible. It's in the heads of the smartest people. I mean, Saul talks about this all the time. And so I think we have to come to the table now with new ideas that get people excited, right? Because I would argue that, if you want better chances of reducing the number of wars and creating peace and quickly creating markets for the things that you are selling, then investing in this kind of explosion of access to education is exactly the right thing to do. Now, we're not quite there yet, but our education folks are working on it. And so the new head of our education group built an unbelievably wonderful educational system in Rio de Janeiro. Fantastic in the poorest communities. She went from having terrible outcomes to having fantastic outcomes in a really short period of time. And these are the kinds of people, I hope Claudia Costin is her name, who will work with all of you. And I would urge you to reach out to her so that we can begin thinking together about a whole new message that I hope will inspire even more investments in education.
No, I think it's great and really exciting. And I think then both looking at, I think also the key role that you all can play, given your access and just supporting countries to be like creative, effective, but also ambitious. And then, how do we leverage other bilateral donor funding and more bank funding for this, and sort of so the whole thing is additive.
Right. I mean, finance ministers still don't get this. And so I was just in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Lebanon, and I started using the term. You guys have to think about your investments in education as education for competitiveness, because what Saudi Arabians are saying, by 2025 we may be an oil importing country, right? And so what do? And when the oil runs out, and when we have to start thinking about the next stage, what do? And we've really focused on education, and they hadn't really thought about education as a tool for improving their own ability to compete in the global economy. And so that's the direction we're going in with finance ministers. And as we do that, of course, more support would be really important. Yeah.
Great. And I have one more question I want to ask, but I'm also conscious that some folks have submitted questions, and I want to make sure some of those get in, and I know your time is relatively limited. We're actually thrilled you've given us this time. So I had a couple of people that had pre-submitted questions, and I'm wondering if maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions and then some answers to those. So I think we had Umesh. If folks could get up, and then maybe we can just hand a mic. And then also, I think Nancy Gardner and Bruce and Ramatu. So why don't we take those first, and then we'll see if people can ask really short questions. Then we can hopefully do a second round. So does somebody have a mic there that they can hand? Thank you.
I'm Bruce Preville from the San Jose Results Group. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your out-of-the-box thinking. And the United Nations-sponsored post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals can be a unifying conversation of and by and for humanity, for a viable future. These goals are being created now, and will address many of the same issues that results in other groups that are in the room are committed to. What do you see as needed from individuals and groups like Results in the promotion and fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, go ahead.
So I would like to take this moment to think about my teacher who always said that nothing is impossible because the word impossible itself says, I am possible. So I heard the same thing in Mr. Kim's speech. And so in this modern world where we have hundreds of thousands of people leaving their country because of war and all other kind of things, and they do need to live under the budget of $1 per day, or even 5 kilograms of rice and 1 kilogram of potatoes for 15 days. How does the goal of eradicating poverty by 2030 works for those people?
Okay, thank you. And then Nancy?
Hi, Nancy Gardner from Trumbull, Connecticut. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for being here. And I have to tell you, my daughter graduated from Dartmouth while you were president, and I texted her jokingly last night and said, do you have a message for Jim Kim? And just so you know, she didn't sleep through all your speeches. She immediately texted back something that I think you must have said pretty often to Dartmouth students, which was, the world's troubles are your troubles, and there is nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. So. I know that was a quote from a former Dartmouth president, but just so you know, she remembered. But my question is really that as we're coming to the end of the period, the deadline for the MDGs, if you could choose one MDG where the world has fallen short, but that you think we really need to focus our attention for the future, what would it be and why?
And then, Jim, just one other question that that I just want to ask because it came to us from a number of Southern advocates and partners that we work with around the world, which is just a kind of specific question, but related to pro-poor infrastructure, which is just the issue of road safety and how it's just become, especially these high-speed roads, it's become a much bigger issue and in some ways overtaking HIV/AIDS in parts of the world. And given the bank's kind of investment in this, are there really specific ways that the bank could really play a role in kind of creating safer roads? Because again, it's the poor that are most disproportionately impacted by that.
Thanks. So thank you for your questions. Great questions. Bruce, here's my biggest concern about the MDGs. Right now, there are sort of 17 theme areas and 160 individual goals. The Secretary General he's an incredibly patient man, and he's a man who really wants everyone to participate. And so we've now got a situation where you have just everybody with, sort of hanging their ornaments on the tree, and we need now some focus, right? And I think what you need to really insist upon is that these goals should not, these goals should be actionable, they should be clear, there should be goals that people can repeat, and that we have to stop this fighting about trying to get every single thing into the goals. Because if there are goals in there that are just, in fact, impossible, then it's going to hurt the credibility of the whole process. Like, for example, it talks about the complete eradication of tuberculosis. But, as many of you know, that there's something, called, people who are actually infected but are not actively sick with tuberculosis. About 2.5 billion people. So to achieve that goal, you'd have to kill all those 2.5 billion people, right? So you can't have that kind of thing, right? And so we will do that. But right now, the approach, and I completely agree with the Secretary General's approach, has been to have, a big tent, let everyone come in. But I think you guys should absolutely insist that these have to be workable, these have to be definable, they have to be achievable, right? Now, one of the things that we're going to do that I think will help a lot is that we're going to be much clearer about what the financing plan is. Because last time, what it was is we announced the MDGs, and then 2 years later, we had a conference on financing. And this set of MDGs turned out to be mostly about how to split up official development assistance. We think the new set has to go far beyond that. And we think we have to be honest about, well, which countries should actually pay for this particular MDG out of, better tax returns, right? Better tax collection. You're seeing that countries that have extremely low tax collection but high needs, the donor countries are objecting, saying, wait a minute, why should taxpayers in the UK, for example, I mean, was in the papers. You know, they were saying that the UK taxpayers were saying, why should the UK taxpayers who pay their taxes have to support these other countries whose taxpayers don't pay taxes? So I think we have to have an honest conversation about need for better domestic resource mobilization. We have to look at which parts should be paid for by grants, which should be paid for with low-interest loans, for example, and which of the goals can be achieved through acceleration of public-private partnerships. So that's one of the things we will do. But please, please, you know, let's not see this as a sort of mural where all of our great, you know, aspirations are represented, because if that happens, they will not behave and they will not spur action the same way that the previous MDGs did. So please focus on that. You know, Ramesh, I think it was, yeah, you know, it's a very moving and poignant question. And, you know, as someone who's worked in places where there were a lot of people living on less than $1 a day, places like Haiti, places in Africa, this is why we need to continue to focus on the ending extreme poverty goal. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard because the temptation will be to focus on just the big countries where, you know, inputs will lead to a lot of outputs, meaning less people in extreme poverty. But there are island countries, Democratic Republic of the Congo, that's such a difficult place to work. 70% of the people there are living in extreme poverty. So, you know, making sure that we don't forget anyone and continuing to insist that we see the face of the poorest in the work that we do, I think is really important. On the MDGs that we failed on, just to clarify, I used to say that all the time. And it was a quote from a former president, the 12th president, who was the person who started the public relations arm of the State Department under Franklin Delano Roosevelt here in the United States, for the person that Kuhl, Gautam, and knew, named John Sloan Dickey. And he said it. He gave a very short, in his very first invocation in 1946, he said, I just want you to know two things, that first, the world's troubles are your troubles, and that there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. And I really do believe that. And it turns out that Thomas Piketty's whole volume suggests just that. Suggests that it's investing in human beings that is one of the two things that actually can lead toward more fairness, more equality in the world. And so that's one of the things. Now, in terms of the MDGs, there are a lot, unfortunately, that we failed on. You know, certain things that I think, the one that I think is just right in front of us that we have to fix is MDGs 4 and 5 around maternal and child health. And I know that you're working on it. This is something we have to work on together. I think, though, that there has been a very unhelpful argument and debate between the maternal and child health community and the HIV, TB, and other community. You know, what about my priority? What about your priority? Come on, you know, the thing that we now need to do, and the thing that we really can do, is to build functioning health systems that can deliver across the priorities. And we know it can happen. They're doing it in Rwanda. We've done it since the beginning at Partners in Health. They're not more expensive. And at the end of the day, if you add up all the things that we spend in building these little narrow vertical programs, they're going to be much, much cheaper. So that conversation has to change. You know, Tim Evans, who is leading our health practice, has been the most important global advocate for that vision for a very long time. So I hope we can move in the right direction. And road safety. So it turns out that there are so many interventions that are win-win-win interventions, right? Let me give you one example. Bus rapid transit. Who knew that creating special bus rapid transit lines with the natural gas driven buses that they already have in India? So just today we released a report that said that if you built 1,000 kilometers of bus rapid transit lanes in India, it would reduce traffic fatalities and other deaths due to air pollution, for example, by 94,000 people a year. It would create 128,000 jobs, and it would take 40 million tons of carbon out of the air, right? So there are just some no-brainer win-win-win approaches that are good for the climate, good for people, good for road traffic safety, that we just should start implementing. And the reason that we put this report out is because we tried to show that in two areas. One is public transport, cleaner public transport, and the other is just efficiency in buildings, energy efficiency. That if the world simply embraced those two interventions, that two of the least controversial of the climate-related interventions, just those two, by 2030, the overall GDP would grow by $1.8 trillion a year over and above business as usual. In other words, if we just follow the path we're on right now, it would be at one level, and if we followed this cleaner path, it would be $1.8 trillion a year higher. Right? So we're removing that argument that says, well, you know, fighting climate change is okay, but it's going to be a real hit on growth. With these two interventions, it's actually going to spur growth. So, you know, there are just, it's so exciting that the evidence and the analysis is showing us that so many of the right things to do are actually the smart things to do.
Thanks on that. And Jim, I'm getting the signals from your team that we've got about 5 more minutes. So I'm wondering, John, I don't know if you've been tracking maybe the very last 2 questions. If do you want to shout out?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay, great.
Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for leading the World Bank in eradicating poverty by 2030. I'm an undergraduate in college, and I'm looking forward to starting a new results group on campus. And I would like to ask, what is one piece of advice you would give a young person like me in order to become a good and successful leader like you? Thank you.
And then Lynn, yeah, there she is.
Hi, this question is personal, but I want to make it good for the whole room. So you told us earlier that you wanted us to communicate this vision to our members on the Hill, to Capitol Hill. So for 29 years I've been in results. 26 of those years I lobbied Congressman Jerry Lewis, former chairman of the House Appropriations. And my new member of Congress is Raul Ruiz. So I want your suggestions on how to communicate this vision. Our group, I personally have to admit, I have not done a good job communicating results, issues, and policies to Raul Ruiz so far. What is your advice for our best way to make that case forward to Congress? Thanks.
Well, Raul Ruiz happens to be my former student. So it's related to the other question, right? Raul has a great story, as you know. He was a son of migrant workers and grew up in the Palm Desert, went to UCLA, and went to UCLA after he went around from door to door begging people for contributions to his college education. He then did so well that he was admitted to Harvard Medical School, where he became my student. And for a time, worked in Partners in Health projects in Chiapas specifically. And you know, I'm not saying he looks too much like Subcomandante Mark. No, I'm just kidding. Erase that. But Subcomandante was there long before Raul went there. But you know, Raul is one of the really great people, and he, if he's not seeing you, I will go and call him this afternoon, and make. Now, he's a member of Congress, and so I don't know that, you know, a call from his old professor will work, but I will call him. And I can tell you, though, he's totally on board with all the issues that you want to push. It's just that he's in the middle of a tough re-election right now. And so if there's something all of you can do, I can tell you, Raul is one of the great people. He's going to be completely 100% behind your issues, and helping Raul is also a good thing. So anyway, I want to be sure that that you know, everybody on all sides of the aisle are listening to you guys, and so I will give him a call and ask him to see you. And in terms of students, you know, let me be a little bit clinical about this, right? In the sense that I have been a student of leadership for more than 20 years. And more than anything else, because it struck me right away that trying to get anything done in a really poor country, trying to get anything done with a group that's larger than one, requires, a kind of skill that very few people walk into the world with. And so I've spent a lot of time having, what's the right word? I spent a lot of time studying leadership, and I've also spent a lot of time being coached. I have a coach now. I've had 3 coaches, because I really think it's something you can get better at. And what's the one thing that everybody in leadership training seems to agree on? The one thing that everyone seems to agree on is that you really need to get tough, direct feedback from everyone around you, the so-called 360 analysis. And I have a coach now who's just withering in his ability to break down all my defenses and tell me what I need to do better, right? So if there's one thing that everyone can learn about being a leader, is that you have to actively cultivate the humility to listen to the people around you, right? It's not, so most people think of leadership, especially young people, as giving charismatic speeches, right? And it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's the very small part, really, of what you need to do to become a better leader. And so, for example, at Dartmouth, at the Tuck School of Business, which is ranked usually, among the very top schools in the world, they start from day one giving you feedback about how you participate in a team, about how you present yourself, and they're giving it to you constantly. And so you build that into what you do every single day. And so I do it too. I just received my 360 analysis from my own direct reports at the World Bank Group. And I was supposed to do it today, but we're doing it next week. I'm going to sit there and read to them the most negative comments that I got. And my request is, this is something I've heard before, and I need your help. Please help me to get better at these things, and we'll start measuring, and next year you'll do it again, and we'll figure out if I got better or not. And it's the hardest thing in the world to do, to really listen to the people who report to you and the people who you report to in an anonymous fashion so they can give it to you. The first response was, wait a minute, they weren't supposed to see that. I was sure that they weren't seeing that, I might have been thinking that, but I was, And so if you can do that, that's really the mark of a great leader, that you can continue. And I find it incredibly hard to do. And every time I do it, I find it hard to do. But the point is not, the project is not your leadership. The project is getting done what the group can get done. And if that's the case, you should be willing to take anything, including that kind of feedback.
It's making me think about my next evaluation. You guys out there, be nice. No, it's good. No, don't be nice. Actually, that was the message. But just, I was going to say this is the beginning of a process, but it's not at all. It's the middle of a process. I mean, we've been, again, as you said, we've been partners with Results, and now all of our partners for many years, but I think it's hugely exciting moment. It is the middle of a process. A lot of what's going to, it mattered a lot to have you here. A lot of what's going to matter is just the follow-up that we do together to really take some of these things forward in the most concrete, but also most ambitious way. So just thanks for your leadership, and thanks for being here.
And while I asked you to relay this message about who we are and what we're trying to be, the other message is keep putting the pressure on us. Our 70th anniversary is coming up, and I hope that no one wants to start a 70 years is enough movement yet, right? We are now, we're here. Edith, does everybody know Edith? Yeah, Edith, stand up. So for the first time, we've hired a person whose specific job is to interact with all of you. We have somebody focused on civil society organization. We have another person we've hired who focuses specifically on faith-based organizations. And our commitment to working with you goes to the point of actually creating a position and bringing Edith on board. So keep telling us what you're thinking, keep pushing us. We'll try to explain what we do. Thank you very much, everybody.